Thank you very much. It's really a great honor, and good evening, everybody. I've just been talking to Corey, and she asked me how our year here was. And I told her, it was good. It was magical. And it was magical partly because I've been together with my 3 kids. And probably for the last time under one roof as 3 of them, because the oldest one is going off to college, you know, kind of moving out. And for another reason, it was magical because I was with the Cleveland Hungarian community. And I have heard all sorts of different stories, and I also learned about my own stories. But what's been really very, very amazing, that being Hungarian here is not just an identity. It's not even a subjectivity. It's a life. So most people have not 9 lives as cats would have, but at least 2 different lives. And that's really amazing and magical. So thank you very much for allowing me to be part of that experience. And now, the title of the talk today is My Life, My Story, My Identity, My Slice of Americana. My Slice of Americana comes from an interview with a person who denied until the last minute of the interview that he had to do with Hungarianness. And I will talk a little bit about that. And then he came to a kind of a hesitation. And I will explain why, but it's going to be the last slide. So you have to keep up until then. So what I will talk about tonight is ethnocultural identity in narrative. And don't worry, I was told to gear the talk to a general audience. So I kind of got rid of all the important names and extra concepts and extra difficult language that, you know, has to go with the academia. Although what I've been learning recently is that the more I gear my writing and my things to a general audience, the more successful it's going to be with the academia. Because those people don't like to read stuff that is, you know, hard to read. So the research project. Post-memory, that's very important to discuss here. Some of the major themes emerging in the stories. And I first thought 8 personal narratives, but then it turned out to be, I think 4 narratives, but then they're cut up into smaller pieces. So you'll see how it takes me. Narrative, that's really like story. Some people argue that they're not synonyms, but I think they're synonyms pretty much. Storytelling is an utmost human activity for several reasons. First of all, it involves memory. It's fact and experience. Fact is something we see, experience is how we tell it. It's already almost a story. It's iterative, which means we keep telling the same story to different people, different audiences, and that makes a lot of difference. We build on story frames and scripts. It means that we already have our stories by the time we encounter new things in our lives. So it's very human. Second thing, it involves language. That's beyond any doubt very human. It's oral and written language, different telling patterns. It includes social skills, choices. Who do we tell our stories to? How do we tell those stories? How do we friend people whose stories we want to hear or we want to tell our stories? Second thing, communities build stories, and the stories build the communities. The ability to speak and listen, I think that speaks for itself. 2 roles are involved, a listener and the speaker. These are interchangeable, especially in a conversation, but nevertheless very human roles. Social skills, what's a good story? A good story has to be engaging, entertaining. It contains an element of the unknown. We need to hear something that is new, that we're going to take away with us. And by the way, please complain if you don't take anything away tonight. We have to connect to the listener. We have to have referential points where they can somehow join in the story that they are hearing. They have to have a familiar script. The story has to be logical. And not necessarily linear, because that's boring too. A little bit of drifting here and there from the main storyline is definitely allowed. It has to balance known and unknown information, complex but not too heavy on the audience. What kind of stories do we tell? Personal, definitely, and canonical. We all know these kinds of conversations. I have seen this movie, and it's a great movie. We're already telling a canonical story, something that is accepted for wider audiences. What do stories tell us? Identities, who the person is, interpreted facts and experiences, that's very important, descriptions, and very often conversations. What is the purpose of the stories? We make a point more emphatic when we're conversing with someone and we decide to tell a story at an abrupt point. We want to make our opinion, our argument, much stronger than if it would be without the story, actually. Reconstruct memories. That's very important. One way, I'm pretty sure everybody has that experience, when something had happened to us or to somebody else that we would like to tell, but it's really hard to tell at one point. We have to wait until we process the information into a tellable, a linear story with right proportions of unknown and known information. Now that's a hard task. We do explain things with stories. I try to do that with my children. They don't tolerate it very well. Mom, this is again one of those stories, huh? And we assume social positions. That's also very important. I can relate to that story. Of course, I can speak that language, so we can share those things. This makes narrative, after all, the most human complex thing. Our dog can tell us a story, but that's a different one. The research itself. I have told some people here that since the beginning of my career, I have been wearing two hats. One is fitted well, that's a teacher's. I love teaching. It's really great to see how people open up to new information and how we can bring the stories into teaching. Their stories and our stories. My other hat is teaching American studies. When I joined the university crew, that was the only position that opened. I had my thesis in applied linguistics, which is pretty much methodology and teaching. They told me, well, would you like to teach American studies? I said, yeah, perhaps. That was, well, referring to Hungarian history, that was the Bokros Csomag, which is the economic program that, you know, got rid of people in certain jobs, and universities, of course, weren't in a very good negotiating position. So I wasn't in a very good negotiating position either. So I started teaching American studies with a hat that was too tight or too wide, I don't even know. I felt like I'm on an island, and if I take 2 steps, I'm in the water, deep, deep water, and I'm in trouble. But throughout the years, I got used to that and got rid of some of the subjects, gained new ones. It worked out quite nicely. But my 2 hats took me to this particular research as well, because I decided to do a PhD, which is a must for university staff, basically, in applied linguistics. I knew those people, I liked the subjects, but then my then boss told me that if the focus is not on American studies, I'm not going to be employed. So I scratched my head and figured out how to do the things and applied for a Fulbright grant. That Fulbright, everybody told me that, you know, you're not going to get that Fulbright. I promised my husband, we're not going to get that Fulbright, don't worry. We got the Fulbright. It landed us in Iowa City. It's very vaguely visible there. That's a really great place because the only thing you can do there is study. Nothing else. There are some really very, very nice people. So I appreciate that I was there and spent a year there. Bendy was 3.5 years old. He loved that John Deere was in the neighboring village. So we had all these truly American experiences there. But what I did there, before I went, my academic advisor had told me that, you know, perhaps you should just do a couple of interviews. That's a cool thing. So I got on the plane, thinking about who should I interview and how do I, you know, conduct interviews. These are the 2 things that I don't know, but otherwise it's going to work out. So I found this course, American Studies course, interviewing Americans, and I thought, you know, that's probably my place. So I went there and told the instructor that I'm going to interview Hungarians. He said, are you going to find Hungarians in Iowa City? I said, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic that Hungarians are everywhere. So I took the local phone book and searched for the most common names. And I found a couple, called a couple of people. One told me she was Czechoslovakian. I didn't tell her Czechoslovakia ceased to exist a while ago. And she said, but I'm open to an interview. I didn't go back to her, obviously. But she was really nice. So I ended up with 3 interviewees, and I conducted the interviews, 3 with each of them. And they turned out to be really amazingly very interesting. I learned the trade while doing it, which is probably not the best approach, but it's an approach that can definitely work in some cases. So that was the starting database, and by now I have 52 interviews with approximately 300,000 words. That's a lot. And some people warn me, you know, you should stop interviewing because you should do something with the material. And so now I'm trying to do that. These are unstructured interviews. Unstructured means that I meet the person and tell the person, you know, please tell me what you find most important about your ethnic heritage, or tell me your life, or whatever would be a so-called grand tour question. How to know that person, what I would assume could be important for that person. And they start telling a lot of things. And going back 2 or 3 times to the same person works out really nicely, because the first time people usually tell what they think I want to hear. And this is really nice. They try to answer my questions, which is good, but you know, I have different questions. And during the second interview, the ice melts, and they start telling very cherished memories. Sometimes they start crying, which is really very moving. That happened once or twice. So it's really amazing how people have this really defined wish to tell their stories. Like narrative is a human capacity, and they talk about all sorts of memories. Their own memories, their parents' memories, their grandparents' memories, even like going back more than that. And that's when the amazing part comes with the post memories that I'm going to talk about. I did all the transcriptions and the coding by hand. I think I should definitely switch to computer, because that also reveals a few very interesting things that I've just started noticing. The themes, after all this coding, because I had to arrange it into kind of chapters, the first one was self-perception. Now that's very interesting because, again, as I said, first time they say who they think they are. And then throughout the story, throughout the interviews, most people not just explain who they are, but they open up the sphere, telling how they have multiple identities, how they have not just multiple identities, but sometimes even 2 lives. And so self-perception is really crucial. The second thing was history. Now, history is an amazingly rich topic. I thought first it was just the sense of history. And I was kind of Googling this idea. Is it my idea, or did somebody else deal with that already? It turned out that Reinhard Koselleck already dealt with the concept of the sense of history. But he is a German philosopher, historian, who did not particularly care about having this concept and writing 2 books about the same concept, which is really good. Because you can fast read the things and find what's important and then go on and move on to the second thing. But the sense of history for him means that we go beyond what's in the archives. We go beyond what is structured, linear, written for us, what is objective. But because we all want to have a part in history, we try to position ourselves as parts of history. And that's very exciting when it comes to the interviews, because most of the stories, especially with ethnic identification, come through history. And the parents and the grandparents and the great-grandparents and all the ancestors, or the persons themselves, historical participation. So that's very crucial. Another thing that is very exciting is a sense of geography. So how people relate to certain sites and locations. Not just in Hungary, but in Europe. Because what I also figured, in Iowa City, most Hungarians are actually European Americans. They have mixed ancestry, which was perfectly fine. Actually, publishers are happier about something that is European than Hungarian, unfortunately. We'll have to develop to that. So the sense of geography is very often when they turn to language and they refer to their identities, you know, I keep doing these European things. Not Hungarian things, European things. Like I eat this big dinner, small breakfast. I didn't know that was European. But that's very interesting how people label things through geography, like the coordinates, you know, mapping them. It's always cozy and comfortable to map the things that we're doing. Assimilation. This is definitely a topic. Some of the stories that I'm going to show are about about assimilation, but not directly, you know. Not saying that, yes, they assimilated and then we're fine, we're a happy Hungarian-American family, but it's going to be different. It's very nuanced in that sense. And also customs and ways of doing things, traditions. It's, again, a very exciting topic because it's how people tailor those things to gain meaning. Because narrative, most of all, creates meaning to the things around us, creates meaning to the experiences, makes meaning, and that's the most important thing. How stories appear, there are so-called big stories, Lebovian stories, the ones you know that start with, I'm going to talk about this, and then this is what happened first, and this is the big complicating action, and then this is what I think about this whole thing, and then I get to a coda and an evaluation. So it's a well-rounded thing, like the folk tales. But we do that often. The other one is conversational stories. You wouldn't believe how many stories just surface in very, very short, brief, even abbreviated conversations when we refer to stories. You know when that happened? Or when we tell breaking news that's like, you know, this is going to happen, whoever and whoever are going to get married. And so we all know the stories that support that thought. These are the conversational stories. And very often the big stories about post-memory occur in conversation, especially during the interviews. That's one of the crucial concepts that I would like to tell you tonight. That's a very bleak picture. It's about Hungary. I don't know if anybody recognizes the place. I don't think so. It's really buried somewhere in the southwestern corner of Hungary. It used to be my grandfather's brick burning kiln. It was for you, it's the right, I don't know my right hand and my left hand, so I'm sorry for that. Anyways, in that corner, you can see the Hungarian television's logo. It's because it's totally post-memory. We don't even have a picture of that facility. It comes from the, well, it was a famous documentary, 1 Million Steps in Hungary by Zoltán Rackenbauer. They walked all these very interesting places and they found my grandfather's facility. They wanted my grandmother to sing a song, but she wouldn't, unfortunately. So what's interesting about this place that I spent a lot of time there. I was a sickly child, so my parents were in the academia, traveling a lot. So best thing was to dump the child with the grandparents. So they did that. And trust me, that was a magical world. It was a transformation to fairyland. I was born in Pécs, which was always a college town, you know, miners, people with money, close to the border, Yugoslavian TV with American movies, etc. So this was public transportation. I went there. There were 4 buses going to the county seat, whole day. On a busy day, there were about 40 cars passing in front of my grandmother's window. So we would do things. I wouldn't know everybody. And the facility was still working. So they would still burn bricks there. That was my grandfather's income. And that had this very, very long chimney. So I went there with them. Here, there would be a pond. I think, yeah, this was the pond. By the time the picture was taken, the pond was gone. And this is a very tiny facility. So you could ask why in the 1950s the state never took it. They never took it because it was too tiny. And the raw material, the clay that is essential for such an industrial place, was really very, little. It wasn't too significant. But it was working, giving good money to my grandparents. And so what was happening, we went there, fed the people. My grandfather even bought one of these old mining railroads, like with the rails and the little carts and stuff, so I enjoyed it very much. And they had the woodlands and everything. But what I never realized was how this place actually carried a ton of memories. I'm not sure if it's visible from there. You can make it what's on the chimney. Those are gunshots. And that takes us back to World War II, when that facility was on the map, on every single military map in Europe, because it was a triangulation point. So what happened, and this was one of the last stories that my grandmother shared with me, that they actually, I'm trying to tell you how she told this to me. There were Belgian planes coming, and it was summertime after the harvest, but the corn was still standing. And basically what happened, she took my 2-year-old uncle and she lied in the ditch. And fortunately, the corn was too tall, so nobody saw them and the other workers, so they survived, and the chimney survived. I never noticed the gunshots. Now, there were a couple of things in this story, which works as post-memory for me. First of all, were there Belgian planes? And I checked it, I Googled it. There were 3 tiny units in Belgium that actually joined the Royal Air Force in Britain. So there were. She said they were much louder than the American planes. I don't know if that part is true, though. The other thing, it happened after harvest. Actually, there was a joint attack on Budapest mostly, and the industrial zones, or what is it called? Yeah, an effort on Allied Air Force, whatever, from Bari, Italy, happening in July. July 2nd and July 7th, the corn was still standing. So she was quite right, actually, in telling all these things. And Bendy, I showed him the chimney. He still remembered the places of the gunshots. I never noticed them until she told me. And the chimney was standing until, I guess, the late 1990s, early 2000, because that's when they moved to digital mapping, and they didn't know the triangulation points anymore. So when we think about post-memory, which is actually Marianne Hirsch's terminology, or term, she used it for Holocaust memories for 2nd and 3rd generation survivors. But she was generous enough to write already in the introduction that almost everybody has post-memories. So it's not exclusive to them, but it's, first of all, traumatic memory passed on to surviving generations. But it's not just traumatic memory, but it's any memory passed on to the coming generations. And very often, we don't know how important those memories are in our lives because we don't understand why people behave in certain ways. My grandmother also told me that she would be happy to live on a single penny a month because she has her garden, but she wouldn't want a war. And I didn't, give any particular significance to this. Yeah, there was a war a long time ago, but for her, it was not a long time ago. It was an everyday possibility. It was there. So what really post-memory means for people and for the storytellers whose stories I heard, and I noticed much later that the level when they get to their ancestor stories is a lot more important in defining who they were ethnic-wise, was way after I found this concept. I thought about my own stories, and I realized that it really formulates who we are quite a number of generations afterwards. So it's inter and transgenerational return of trauma knowledge. The past gets internalized without necessarily fully understanding it. Sorry. So we know that this happened. I carry the picture of that facility forever because I had a lot of good memories there. How my cousin was always disobedient to all the orders, etc. But what really is happening, I don't fully understand the experience that connects to those gunshot places. Never. And the chimney is not there anymore. it's gone because they sold the facility. When memory is transferred to another person, it becomes tellable. So my grandmother didn't really tell this, you know, look at those bullet holes there. It's there because this and this happened. She never did that. And I'm pretty sure everybody in this audience carries the same memories that are somehow untold. And yet they are a lot more significant to understanding who we are than if those stories were, you know, told 1,000 times. I know how successful you were. I don't want to be that successful. I know I have to dress up for this occasion, but I'm not going to do that, or whatever. So we know that there are a lot of stories, but those that are untold are always very, very significant because they're heavy. And tellability is always an issue with the stories, especially with interview stories. And what I've noticed when I deal with the language of the stories, there is always some kind of sign of tellability. You know, I'm passing on the tellability right. It's not just that you can use my name in your book, or you cannot use my name because I don't want that kind of publicity. But really, it's, you can tell my story because I'm way beyond kind of understanding what was going on, but I know it's part of who I am today here. And what Hirsch argues is that post-memory is carried through 3-4 generations. It could even be passed on 120 years. We don't know. We do carry memories for a long time, so, and we pass on stories. As I said at the beginning with narrative, we have to always find the right moment to talk about certain things to the right audience. When the audience is ready to hear, you know, I want to hear your story. They're not ready to hear, they're not going to happen, or they're going to go away. How Hirsch writes it really beautifully. She says, there is always a lingering need for a before. So we always want to know that we're part of history, that we have a sense of history because we participated in those events. And it's not really a matter of indexicality, you know, because it's a sense of history. For me, I Googled if there were Belgian planes, if she was right. What if there were no Belgian planes? Well, it was a different plane. Definitely there was a plane. That's the important thing. But what matters most is that she remembered every detail, not like on Wikipedia. It was a different story. So that's post-memory. And with that, I'm moving on to the stories. The first story is a post-memory story because it's Paul's father's experiences in World War II. Paul lives in California today, and he's a retired physicist. And he also speaks perfect Hungarian. I asked people to speak possibly English because then I don't have to translate the interviews into English. His father was working as a physicist in the so-called Haditechnikai Intézet, which is the Institute of Military Technology, if I translate it well, in Budapest. In 1944, just a few days before Christmas, the entire institute was moved to Berlin. So in the very last moment, the father was also moved to Berlin instead of being sent to the front. So I guess, well, who knows which one was better. Obviously, this one was the better choice. And they could take their families with them. And in this story, Paul tells how his father was really cold-blooded. I'm not sure I would be that cold-blooded, but this story goes. And there, at this point, they were under German control, and the Germans decided to separate the wives and the children and the men. They sent the scientists to Berlin, and the wives, they sent them, I think, to Kronach, near Bayreuth. And so my father went to Berlin, and he was assigned a desk opposite to a German physicist in this, I think, in the technical ministry or some official building downtown, and worked through a couple of carpet bombing campaigns there. And then the Germans thought, oh, that must have been terrifying. That's me. Paul was one of the best interviews. I didn't have to say too much. He was really telling these stories. Well, yes, there's an amusing story with regard to that. That's already very controversial here. And he laughs. What happened was that Obviously, my father had long since realized that, first of all, that the war was a bad war and that Hungary was on the wrong side. But he also realized that there was absolutely zero chance of anything other than an Allied victory. But he basically said, well, this is what I have to do, so I will do it. So he and his German scientists were sitting on opposite sides of a larger desk, and the air raid siren came and the bombing began. That's how Paul told me the story. And the German apparently, as my father told it, you know, oh, trembling dove under the desk. And my father just continued to work. And when the air raid was, when the all clear was sounded, the German crawled out from under the desk and said, and my father spoke very good German. He said to my father, well, how on earth can you work at a time like this? And my father said, look, whether I survive or not does not depend at all whether I'm above the desk or I'm beneath. And that's very true, but I would definitely be beneath the desk. So I just decided for myself that's a safe place. And so anyways, yeah, I might as well make use of the time because at least nobody will disturb me. So anyways, the Germans then decided that the Hungarian contingent would be sent to Peenemünde, the rocket base where the V-2s were launched toward England. So they went to Peenemünde, but they found nobody there, so they went back, and they had all sorts of exciting things going on. So what happens, there are a couple of things that I'm going to tell you how post-memory really works in this situation. First of all, normally when we tell a story, we rarely start it with an evaluation. You know, an evaluation part of the story is the kind of the winding down part. When we were signaling to our audience that, you know, this is the end of the story, but you can, you know, expect me to tell a little bit more, but this is really the end. In post-memory stories, especially when the tellability is very problematic, I already mentioned about the tellability, very problematic because he was technically on the wrong side. So he had to think about, will I judge him? You know, he was on the wrong side, working in Berlin. He went there instead of, you know, sacrificing his life. Of course I wouldn't because I wanted to write the book, but that's a different thing. So what happens here is it gives me this long evaluation. Evaluation part when he wants me to understand how to think about his story. I'm giving you tellability rights, but I'm telling you under what circumstances. And this is very typical only with post-memory stories. Normally, you know, I'm proud of what I did, so I'm going to tell you what I did. And this is what I did. Here, it's not. I'm proud of what my father did, because obviously he survived by all means. But, you know, you have to be cognizant of how to handle this, and handle this with care, because it's fragile. So that's one of the very typical things. Another thing that I've just very recently read about this whole discourse analysis business is laughs. Normally, during an official interview, we rarely laugh. But laugh has a very strong conversational value. Here, are you with me? Do you understand what I'm going to tell you? I want you to be on the same level. So this is funny. I'm giving you rights. I've explained to you how this whole thing works. But you have to have the premises. And one premise is you understand when it's funny and it's not funny. And so he signals that. And I took it, of course, and that made sense. Another thing that's very important, especially in post-memory stories, but sometimes in other stories too, is the use of reported speech. Now, when we tell a story about ourselves, we author the experiences. There are the facts. Our listener was not there, probably, unless we share the story. So we technically author how we're telling that. You know, like I have a funny story. I was, I think, 6 when I went to school, told my parents that, you know, I'm so skillful I can climb all these ropes and then climb to the other rope, and they believed me. And a year later I went home, you know, I can climb half the rope. And that's when they started, you know, becoming very unsure whether I was telling the truth the first time. But I was, of course. So it's just how we create, and probably I was trying to climb the stupid rope, so technically that's the truth by element of that. And then I knew I told this to my parents, so I was struggling to learn how to climb the rope. So what happens during the stories, we have the facts, and then we manipulate the facts, technically. That's how we make sense, gear it towards the audience, add them, make these things meaningful, because that's the most crucial thing. So what really happens here is whatever must have been uttered by Paul's father is in reported speech. So he switches, and it's not his story anymore. It's his father's words, even though they are translated into English because we're conversing in English, but nevertheless that happens. So these are, I even highlighted laugh or put it in bold, because that's very important, because I was supposed to laugh. And the story was funny because you were laughing too. But that had a meaning. Now, another story that I would like to show you tonight is, and of course I do a lot more with this story because I analyze the tense uses and how it performs, how the story performs, told by a second-generation Hungarian American to a Hungarian person whom Paul thought would probably understand things in a slightly different way. So he actually changes certain things, and we converse, etc. But I think that's also very interesting. We go back to the Great Depression. Andy Fodor has the same last name as I have, so that's how I kind of fished him. He is from Ohio University, close by, and our Faculty of Business and Economics has a very lively connection with Ohio University. And they were celebrating the 25th anniversary. And I'm the translator usually at the university, so whenever something happens, they grab me. I have to go there and do this thing for them. So what I noticed is there's this guy with my last name. So that's already suspicious. He must be a Hungarian American, so I must grab him. And so I wrote him an email, and he was volunteering for the interview, and so we did it. Unlike Paul, I had to like drag the words from Andy. He is an economist, so it was hard stuff. But then through the second and third interviews, he was, you know, getting lighter, and he told all these things. So he talks about his grandfather was Hungarian, and then there were all sorts of European ancestries in the family as well, but he was really very close to his grandfather. His grandfather did not have a college degree, but he taught calculus to Andy. So he was really bright, and they shared a lot and had these moments. He made good coffee, I learned from the interview. So Andy told me this story. It's slightly different than the previous one in structure. Some of the stories I just print replica, you know, lines after each other. But some of the stories don't seem to work that way, because the person is a different storyteller. Some storytellers use more like poetry when they are telling stories. Poetry meaning less linear in style and more driftings. You know, I'm going to jump here, I'm going to jump there, but I will have the refrains, the same lines, closing the whole thing, and I'm going to help you with the conclusion. Remember, Paul's strategy was that he gave me the evaluation. That's what you should think. With the poetry style thing, it's more like the refrain is giving us the idea of what's going on there. So he was like, yeah, my one thing that was unique also about my great-grandmother, when she passed away, we found a lot. She had multiple freezers in her house. And we found that she had a lot of food that was 5 or even 10 years old. So obviously, there is already something very, very suspicious with tellability. You know, do I tell people that my grandmother was crazy? Not really. That's not what I'm proud of. So how he tells me this is like slowly, he's very hesitant. There are a lot of ums, like, stoppings, etc. And I talked to my grandpa about it. You know, grandpa was knowledgeable, not just calculus-wise, but all sorts of things. And he said that he thought that was just a function of when he was a kid. He said there were days where they would not have food, or they would have to go out and hunt and, you know, they would try to get a rabbit, or whatever they could find to have food. And he felt that she had such an insecurity, and she still had an insecurity with that. And she did not have trust that she would always have what she needed. So she made her feel more safe, because they had an extremely hard time. They had all these children, and there was a time that the Great Depression that was the current here in the United States. So it's happening here. Andy actually told this story during our first interview, towards the end. And then he kept coming back, feeding me more details. So during the second interview, we came back and he told me about the rabbit hunt and the crow hunt. And then he told me about, again, how after the interviews, he had this strange phone call from his brother who was not interested in the Hungarian heritage, but then he decided to go back to the old house, which was still the property of the family. So there were very interesting coincidences. So Andy was probably with this very unique, very sketchy story structure, he was telling me, there is a lot more to that I really had a hard time pulling all that information from him, but eventually we got to the point. So what happens here is each of those stanzas that are very short are reflecting on something that he himself had no first-hand information about. So he has to go back, and we don't really have reported speeches, or I didn't use, quotation marks, whatever. It's just how Andy remembers his grandfather remembering the great-grandmother's ways of doing things, which way, way after the Depression were still seem to be very valid. For Andy here, he was not traditionally Hungarian American. He was Hungarian American in a very unique way. He loved to travel. He went to Europe on multiple Erasmus teaching fellowships, to Italy. And he told me he was a lot more understandable toward the cultural differences. So when Vietnamese students started cheating during a math test, he thought, it was culture. And I was like, was it culture? Hungarian students do that, but I don't write it on culture, I write it on something different. But he always said, I try to learn the ways of doing things because I learned how we should all be very tolerant towards those people. Now, two stories that are on a lighter note. Here, they're post-memories, not so much about history, but as I said, more about assimilation. They're about pants, particularly brown pants. I don't know why first-generation Hungarian Americans refer to brown pants, wearing brown pants at schools, but that's a recurring theme, that they struggle. Did anybody have brown pants here for elementary school? I don't know, but that came up, and that was very un-American, very uncool. So they struggle with that. Catherine is actually second generation. His father came as a child after the 1956 revolution. She grew up in Chicago, but she had nothing to do. Chicago has a large Hungarian community, but she didn't really go with her dad to participate in those events. But she had a very interesting sense of what's going on with her Hungarian heritage. And I think this is really a lovely story, how Catherine thinks about her father's difficulties, or the way her father talked about those difficulties, like my grandfather talked about her difficulties, makes her more understanding. Not just more understanding, towards explicit things like, I need a pen. Do you have an extra pen? Could you please lend me a pen? Sort of things. But when people are vulnerable, it's kind of like a special pair of glasses that we put on and we see people's vulnerabilities. We tend to respond to those vulnerabilities. And what she refers to here is to see how people are vulnerable for several reasons. And she thinks she's more responsive to those. So a lot of people don't know where Hungary is. They say, do you speak Hungary? I mean, they don't, a lot of people, Americans don't understand. Oh yeah, and I just feel like I'm more cultural. Can you think of any incident? This is my very first interview. I was really clumsy. I didn't know how to push her to tell the stories. I didn't hear when she wanted to tell a story, so I was really messing up with things, but some things came out nicely. Can you think of any incident or experience that relates to this? No, 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 I don't think I can. Like you've mentioned, you're more open to minorities. What does that mean? Oh, a lot of friends. All my friends are very Americanized. And so they might be like, where's that person from? And I'd be like, oh, he can't speak English. See, he can't speak English. It's not she can speak English, it's he can speak English. Let's just give him a chance. And you know, my father went through this, through that, and I'm sympathetic. Does he tell you about this often? Oh yeah, he said it's the hardest thing. What did he say? Well, he said he got made fun of all the time when he first came here because he couldn't speak English correctly. He got in a fight a lot. A lot of people made fun of him and his name. And what did he do when facing with this? Oh, he would fight back, got in trouble. I think that's part of the reason why he's so strict sometimes. She kept telling how his father's Hungarian ways made him much stricter than normal American parents. So he's so strict sometimes because he grew up sort of rough. Not only in Hungary, but here too. Yeah, it was a hard transition. He's an only child, and he always says he wishes he never was an only child. He was always lonely. Coming here by himself, basically, you know. Does he tell you any particular story about it? I was very pushy. He just says one when he was on the playground. When he was in grade school and some picked up a rock and had tar on it and smeared it on him. And so he spared it back and the tar was on one of them, so it got ruined. So his mom was upset. So eventually she tells the story of the hardship that really it turns out she heard it a lot, but she heard it so many times, probably at an age where it didn't make sense. She was not the proper listener. You know, you had those hardships and who cares? Because we're not sensitive. I think we can all, yeah, you told me 100 times that you did much more at this age. But then they're not yet listening to what we're trying to say or what they're trying to say to us. And then there is a time it still keeps working. So it's there. She doesn't know a lot of details, just how it must have been difficult, because she already met people who didn't speak English, who felt miserable. And she felt that there was this exposure to a culture that the person didn't know and had no idea and had to live up to the standards. And I don't know how much time I have left. I have to finish up soon, or what do you think? Okay, so I skip the brown pants, get to my slice of Americana. That was a guy, he was the only person who asked me to switch off the tape recorder when he told me he was in the military. It was very interesting. He didn't say anything particular that I could use in my future life. He just asked me, and that was the exciting part, because we were taught that sometimes people ask you to switch off the tape recorder. So he asked me to switch off the tape recorder. And his first sentence was, when we met, you know, it's only my last name. Nothing else is Hungarian. And so we still talked about a lot of things. It turned out that he kept visiting relatives in South Bend who were totally old world, listening to music, fixing motorcycles, having blood sausage cooking. So that's very old world. No middle American vanilla there. But he was really very nice. He even offered to me that if I wanted to stay a year more in Iowa City, I could. Well, I didn't. Not because of Iowa City. So what he was trying to argue, he came from a mixed ancestry family. His mother was Irish and Scottish. His father was Hungarian. His wife was Irish. So he came from all these mixed backgrounds, but kept talking about how he remembered all these things. And it got to a point when he argued, well, I was born here in the Midwestern part of America. I had no will. I was not submerged into a culture. For me to say I'm Hungarian American is kind of false. I mean, what part of me do you see as Hungarian? And he was not angry, so he was really nice. Is my appearance Hungarian? Is my tongue Hungarian? Is what I eat Hungarian? No, not for me. If someone else says I'm a German American, I don't quite understand that. We're getting to a point in history, at least in my part of America, that's hard for me to understand. I'm only saying it from my experience because I know that this is not true for every family and every situation. But I think that through intermarriage, through integration, with a very multicultural, varied experience, people are losing their identity, as something in my slice of Americana, which is the Midwest. And then we went on discussing this whole thing. It was kind of pushy. Turned out his wife made the choice. She said, you know, your mother is Irish, I'm Irish, so we're Irish, because we have more blood, we have more Irish blood. And really, before I conclude, it's one of the founding fathers of this country who said this really wise thing about marriages. Keep your eyes wide open before marriage and half shut after. We did it the wrong way, I guess, but, you know, it's up to everybody else. So obviously they didn't specify these things. So what my conclusion is, post-memory is important. We have to keep trying to tell our stories, figuring out the right audiences, and we have to keep trying to make our experiences into stories, because that matters a lot. And ethnic identity is subjective. It's narrative. It cannot be measured, counted, you know, put on graphs, whatever. As I said here, it's a life. Elsewhere, my slice of Americana does not tolerate being Hungarian. My slice of Americana, you know, whatever it is. And investment theories, Pierre Bourdieu saying that ethnicity is cultural. Well, I say that ethnicity belongs here, but Bourdieu says there is cultural and social capital out there. And we live with that, or we try to make the best profit out of whatever cultural or social capital we have. Ethnicity definitely belongs to that kind of knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention. We need all of these things. Yeah. That's fine. Yeah, if you have any questions, I would be glad. And I'm writing this book, lagging behind time. So when I get back to Hungary, I think I'll start my race with time. Or ask for a deadline extension. That's also a possibility. But, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
When you spoke about post-memory, that is given by way of narrative from one generation to the next?
Yeah, when our parents are telling us.
Is there also a way, because there's talk about possibly really traumatic post-memory events, like, you know, the death camps or work camps, could possibly even be in the genetic code of, I mean, there's talk about that. Is that anything you came across?
I don't think so. I think in the 1980s, when I started working with identity, I was like, oh boy, there's a lot of research out there. Those people were ahead of me. And I figured that that was kind of the turning point. Up until then, the mid-1990s, identity was more considered to be essential. You're born what you're born. What the My Slice of Americana guy is doing, denying this. It's constructed. It's, you get certain things and you make up what you want with that. And I think post-memory definitely plays on that side. And it can be very traumatic.
So it's behavioral, so to speak.
I definitely think that memory is behavioral.
Right.
Memory, and because stories have multiple interpretations. So it's really very much a quagmire. Because what if you read the story and if you say you're reading something entirely different into that? I'm in trouble. So I do hope that I didn't misread them. But that's really quagmire because it's so personal. And there are so many nuanced pieces of information that are provided with the story, with the theme. So I didn't mention that I'm doing the analysis on 3 different levels because just the theme wouldn't answer questions. The language answers a lot of questions, like how they're negotiating certain parts of their identity. And performance is really doing a great job, like how they're gearing certain stories, how they're making sure that the story would become tellable. How are they conscious of the fact that they're telling this story to somebody who was there or who stayed there? You know, I'm the European. How would a European interpret something that they don't know much about it? I have to wear my other hat. That I kind of grew to like.
You know, some people remember things the way they want to remember them. You know,
Absolutely.
If you talk to that guy's sister, she's going to remember it differently as
Absolutely.
well. So, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's really amazing. I forgot to mention that in post-memory stories, one of the questions very often is that thing true? I'm not sure if that story is true. And it's not archival, it's not indexical. So I'm going on with the story because it defines who I am, but I can never sure. It's always thin ice. Like, you know, I immediately jumped on Google. What if I'm telling you those Belgian planes and there are no Belgian planes? I'm in trouble. Or am I in trouble? Because this is what, exactly, because this is what she was arguing, that she saw those. And in fact, it turned out she was quite right. So yeah, go ahead.
Did you find that if you interviewed people of different ages, that their identities and stories changed?
I think they would be more interested. But it's amazing how sometimes young people are very well-rounded in terms of that. So a lot depends on how they grow up and how they are interested. Like, I never knew I would end up with stories in my research. I was doing a ton of other things. But as I said, when I went to that place, at my grandmother's place, everything was coming out of my storybooks. The fox and the wolf lived in the thick woods. And I told my cousin, you know, don't take me to the woods because it's dangerous. And he took me there, obviously. So that you have an inclination to have that. And I think, yeah, people are different with stories. I guess I'm lucky, but I did have some interviewees who were a lot more protective of their identities, and I couldn't get around in any possible way.
In your research, did you have a chance to interview either siblings or parent and child separately who related the same story to look at the differences in the way that people would recall something?
No, husband and wife.
You had husband and wife?
Yes.
Okay.
Husband and, that was interesting though. Yeah.
Of course,
yeah.
And
they didn't say, yeah, the stories were not significantly different.
They weren't significant?
No, they weren't significantly different. I feel sometimes I really would like to interview that person, but obviously there is not much of a chance in a lot of cases.
It seems to me that the interview of siblings could be quite interesting, particularly if they're somewhat separated by age.
Yes, exactly, and I was thinking about Andy Fodor's brother, but I just didn't have time, and I was told I need to include more women, because I had very few women for some reason. Maybe they married American husbands, and they showed up in the phone book on the American names, so I landed with more. Yeah, go ahead.
What is your most memorable memory of Cleveland?
Most memorable memory of Cleveland? Oh, I have a lot. You know, at some point, I think I told somebody in the family here that I wish this thing is already a story, so which means it's way behind me. But I liked every minute of that. But that also depended on that this whole thing came at kind of the right time in my life. I was really fed up with my colleagues. So, you know, getting anywhere on the globe would be a good solution. I'm now ready to deal with that again. So I don't have that, but I will email it if I have it.
Do you remember how you met the Bishop of Cleveland?
Yes, I remember that I met the Bishop of Cleveland. Yes, I did remember that. I did tell my children that in the Lakewood Park there is this plaque remembering the Underground Railroad. They weren't interested. Yeah, you know, Mom telling the stories. Bendy was interested, I guess. Okay.
If you want to quantify it in terms of retaining some kind of ethnic awareness, how important are these post-memory, the cultural, it's actually cultural transmission.
Yeah, that's right.
And to what extent is that determine the way that person thinks about where they come from?
I think it's extremely important. I think it's extremely important the way they interpret the post-memories, because there are multiple ways, as somebody asked here. And the person has an opportunity to interpret it the way that I'm not interpreting. Like this person, my slice of Americana, his father made the decision. So his father never wanted them to be Hungarian. Never played the game, you know, how to say this in Hungarian or how to say that in Hungarian. He says this very explicitly. And then when I actually asked him, you know, do you know of any particular incident that happened to him, any atrocity? He says, no, I don't know of anything, but he passed away at a young age in an industrial accident. So the whole thing seems to be a closed story. And I think what really reinforced it is this huge difference in the 1960s between an old world household where people felt secure. It's not just the old world traditions, but very often we use the traditions because it gives us security. It's kind of a home because it connects to the stories that we grew up with. So we have to keep those things because it gives us a way to reinvigorate ourselves for the work, conflicts, etc. I do have my own roses, that's what I say, and I look at my roses, which makes me happy. But we need those stories. And then I also think about my grandmother. Boy, she must have felt a lot more vulnerable than I am fighting with these guys, you know, over a couple of things. Yes?
Yeah, very key to your work is the concept of ethnic identity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a working definition of what that is? And I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
You know,
ethnic
how would you do
identity,
that?
I've been struggling with that because there are a lot of really good definitions out there. I thought it's more like an inventory, a set of possibilities available for the person that are ethnically or culturally marked. And they use it as an inventory, you know, as a basis to go back to whenever they would like to create energies. Yeah, that's fine. Would you need any help? All right. Okay. So I understand it as a huge set of possibilities that are out there. And those possibilities are very often coded in the post-memory stories or in the stories. And whether we're at a certain stage in our lives to have a different reading to those stories, that might give a change. And I do think that theory with the language part actually has a lot more depth to it than just simply counting people in particular phases in their lives. Because, for example, Catherine is now having, I think, a Dutch last name. So I would never, ever be able to locate her through that. But she's still, yeah, go ahead.
We'll do this as the last question then.
Yeah, okay. Okay, the two questions.
For the people that you interviewed that didn't seem to be very connected with their Hungarian culture, did you recognize maybe an increase in their interest of reconnecting with that culture after the interview?
I didn't follow up on their lives, but they always became a lot more responsive, a lot more interested, and a lot of them said that they actually started looking at old letters, or this is the first time they ever told their stories. So when I say narrative is an inclination, it's a proclivity of ours to tell our story out there. It's amazing how they relate to that even when they say, you know, I don't have much to say. Oh, I don't really have the stories. I have a Hungarian background, but I don't have the stories. Oh yeah, and I have the story. So could you switch back the recorder? So things like that. So I think it has a certain after effect, a resonating kind of thing. Yeah?
Okay.
I think.
Monika, I wanted to thank you very much. I think it was well, to me at any rate, it was a very different way of explaining stories. It's like a very highly professional way of different terminology and ways of explaining. So that was very interesting. And I wanted to thank you, and I'd like the audience too to thank you very much.
Thank you very much.